If you could choose one word to describe the last week of your life, what would that word be? As you're processing thought and as you're choosing your word, I want to tell you that my word would be challenging. Let me retrace the last 7 days of my life. Last Sunday morning, long before I planned to get up, I was awakened by a stomach virus that is going through our county. Needless to say, my Sunday wasn't a fun day. And those of you who have had it, you know what I'm talking about. Good news, by the afternoon, I was feeling better. I would describe the way I felt as washed out. And there again, those of you who have had it know exactly what I'm talking about. I thought, man, I feel okay. Nothing a good night's sleep can't fix. I went to bed. I awoke at 2:30 a.m. Monday morning. Wasn't my plan. But I realized at 2:30, I'm done. So by 2:45, I've got my cup of coffee, I've got my Bible, and I'm working. You'd be so proud of your pastor. I just gutted it out Monday. I worked with great intensity up to 5 o'clock. I was so proud of the amount of work that I had done. Scott, it's kind of miraculous. Not to just brag on myself, but I guess I am. That evening I realized if I'm going to get a day off this week, it's going to be tomorrow. So I got my fly fishing tackle together. I thought, I'm going to go fishing. Now I called my son, Jonathan. I was going to a section of this creek that I'd never fished, and he's familiar with it, and I kind of want to get the lay of the land. So I called him up and I said, one thing I want to know is it treacherous? He said, well, there's one place where you're going to wish you didn't have on waders because it makes navigating that section of the stream really difficult. I said, well, I'm not going to wear waders. He went, what? Dad, that creek is frigid, and it's going to be in the 40s up there in the morning. I said, son, don't forget who you're talking to. This is Ronnie Hodge, the living legend. And you're not taking into consideration the toughness factor, because you're talking to one tough son of a gun. Some of you thought he was going to say something else, didn't you? He said, okay, tough man. So I got up Tuesday morning, I got my stuff, I got on the trail, and I walked a rather lengthy hike, all downhill. And I'm in a gorge. So I thought, okay, how do I get down there? So I picked a spot. Now, I was on a trail, but to get to the creek, there was no trail. I had to do what we Southerners call bushwhacking. You know what I'm talking about? Now, I got a 9-foot-long fly rod. And I'm snaking it through dog hobble and mountain laurel. But I get down to the bottom of the mountain and discover that it's a 10 to 12 foot drop straight into the river. Well, I can't do that. I wouldn't have done that in my best day. So I climbed back up the mountain. Walked up about 50 yards up the trail, decided, Greg, I'll do it again. So I did, snaked all the way back down, another 10 to 12 foot drop. I thought, okay. Climbed back up the mountain, and there was a place way up the trail where the trail and the creek kind of paralleled each other. I thought, I'll just have to go back there and get in the creek. I did, walked out, finally made it. I'm at the creek. I'm standing on the creek, and I'm thinking to myself, Trout, if you just knew who showed up, you'd tremble in fear. Literally took 3 steps into the creek and fell in. I'm talking about to here. Fell into here. Now I thrashed around for what felt like about 5 minutes, probably just a few seconds. But I eventually got to my feet and I stood up. And I thought, well, Jonathan, you were right about a couple of things. That creek is frigid. And the wind was coming through this gorge and cutting through me like a knife. I heard this still small voice in my mind say, you ought to cut your losses and leave. You can't fish like this. You're freezing. I responded to that voice, you don't know who you're talking to. This is Ronnie Hodge, living legend. I'm one tough son of a gun. I turned and looked down the creek, and I could see this run. That's what we fishermen would call it. That I thought, there's got to be a big old brown trout laying up in that thing, and he's about to do a meet and greet with the preacher. So I eased my way down, and listen, the rivers are running kind of high now and a lot faster than normal because of all the rain, and the currents were all weird. But I'm thinking, I can handle this. So I'm snaking my way down through there, and all of a sudden, Tina, I lose my balance again. Fortunately, there was a huge rock next to me. And I grabbed hold of this rock, and as I did, the front pouch of my fly vest popped open, and something came flying out. It was my iPhone 11 Pro. It landed in the swiftest current, and within 2 seconds, it was gone on its way to Georgia. I said rather weakly, "My phone." And then I heard this voice in the back of my head go, "I told you." So defeated, I went back to the bank, broke everything down, and started the walk of shame back to the truck. Now, you know, when you've had a great day and you're headed back to the truck, you don't run into anybody to ask you, "How'd it go today?" You can say, "I caught 74. 3 of them probably made the state record book." It was like walking into the parking lot at Walmart. I met person after person who wanted, "How did it go today?" And I would say, "You need to mind your own business." So I went home, took a shower, drove down to Verizon, and $1,300 later, I left with an iPhone 12 Pro. Can't say it's the most enjoyable fishing trip I went on, but it was the most expensive fishing trip I've ever gone on. I wish I could tell you that was the low point of my week. All week long, I've battled with insomnia and headaches, and I think they're related. And if that weren't enough, Friday afternoon, my back went out. So all Friday evening, all day Saturday, is all I could do to just get up and down off of the couch. But there was a silver lining in this back pain. Saturday afternoon, my wife turned me on to something called a muscle relaxer. Just making an honest confession, last night, your pastor was feeling rather mellow. I haven't felt like that since the Skinnerd concert back in '76. You know, Lynn's got to watch it from here on. I'll be faking this. Lynn! Now, you're having a good laugh at my expense, and I'm glad. I'm glad something positive is coming out of all that. But I come here today with some bad news. Life will be challenging. You say, "What are you saying, Ronnie?" I'm saying this. We're going to go through periods of life that are going to be every bit as challenging as the last week of my life has been. Now, does that depress you? Some of you are thinking, "Not me, preacher. I'm not depressed at all." Give me 5 minutes. And I think I can succeed in depressing every last one of you. I need to unpack that statement. When I say life will be challenging, what do I mean? At some point in our life, we will experience painful events the Bible describes as trials. And these trials will stretch out over a protracted period of time, a drawn-out period of time the Bible describes as tribulations. You ever heard anybody use that phrase? Trials and tribulations. Well, they're coming. Some of you are saying, no, they're not coming. They're here. During those times, problems will pop up like wild onions in your front yard. And they'll multiply like rabbits. If it can go wrong, it probably will. And if it can go right, it probably won't. Are you depressed yet? Let's keep working at it. There will also be times in life where you experience what the Bible calls persecution. Now listen carefully to me. Listen to me. There are going to be times in your life where you experience something called persecution. It means this, that some human being or some group of human beings will target you. And they will decide that you are their enemy. And that making your life miserable is their life's work. They'll attack, and their attacks will be brutal. Words will be their weapon of choice. And we all know that words hurt, words wound, words can even destroy. They're going to seek to penalize you by making sure that you are shunned, excluded, and ostracized. You know why? For the sole reason that you're a Christian. And your beliefs and values and lifestyle is different from theirs. Well, let's throw one more in there. We can't forget this great battle with temptation. Talk about challenging. We're supposed to live Christ-like. That's a tall order. We're supposed to live lives that can be described with the word holy, which means pure. Yet we live in a sin-promoting world, and we are all sin-loving human beings. That's a recipe for disaster. So, you with me? There are going to be times when you're going through trials and tribulations. Other times when you're being persecuted. Other times when the battle with temptation is intense. Now, just so that you've been fairly warned, I also want you to know this. There'll be times when you'll be experiencing all three of those challenges at the same time. Depressed yet? I gotta add one more. Let me add insult to injury. In addition to those three challenges, we all have a common, invisible, supernatural enemy called the devil. And he's either going to take advantage of these challenges, or he may even create these challenges and use them in an effort to convince us that we ought to give up. Now you're getting it. Some of the things you've been facing, you've been hearing this little voice in the back of your mind go, give up, pack it in, let it go. Give up on what? Maybe give up on our marriage. Give up on our church. Maybe even give up on life. But I'll guarantee you this, the enemy wants you to give up on God. Stop trusting Him. Stop following Him. Give up on Him. As a matter of fact, just go back to your old way of thinking and living. When the challenges of life are dawning and the devil is relentlessly trying to get the best of us, we'll have to make a choice. We can give up, or we can rise up. Ronnie, what do you mean by rise up? We can rise above life's challenges. The circumstances of our life don't have to dictate the quality of our life. We can have joy and we can experience peace no matter what we're facing. No obstacle in our path has to stop our progress or stunt our spiritual growth. We can plow through, go around, or go over every obstacle we ever encounter. No matter what we're up against, we can all keep going and therefore keep growing. No enemy can stop us from fulfilling the work God has called us to do. We can keep right on working no matter how fierce the fighting gets. And we can be more fruitful in our bad days than we ever were in our best days. In spite of the fact that sin is everywhere and sin is tempting, in spite of the fact that the devil is convincing and the flesh is weak, we don't have to compromise and live a watered-down, sin-tarnished life. We can live a holy, God-honoring life right in the middle of this cesspool known as the world. When life is the most difficult, we don't have to give up and turn back. Neither do we have to hunker down and hope to survive. No, there's another option I want to introduce you to. We can thrive. Rather than surrendering, we can declare war and take up arms. Rather than retreating, we can advance. Rather than floundering or faltering, we can flourish. We can rise above the challenges of life. How? I mean, that's a really good question. How? And it's going to take me some time to answer it. Therefore, I'm starting a new sermon series today entitled Rising Above Life's Challenges. While studying the Bible, I came across a group of people who did this. These people didn't just survive, they thrived, and they thrived amidst some of life's most serious challenges. The Bible describes them as the Thessalonians. And here's their story. Thessalonica was a major city in Europe. Population beyond 200,000. Yet in this major city, there wasn't one church. Not one. You know why? Because in this major city, there wasn't one Christian. Not one. Not one saved person in the entire population. But God wanted to change that. And we can read about this in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verse 1 through 10. God wanted to change all that. He wanted to save some of those people and then bring them together and form a church. So he handpicked a team, a mission team. I think it consisted of 3 men, Paul, Silas, and Paul's young protege, Timothy. And he sent them into Thessalonica armed with the gospel, the good news of Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, and the salvation that we can experience through him. And they went in guns blazing, preaching the word. You never believe what happened. People started getting saved. Jews and Gentiles. Paul was there 3 weeks. He and his little team preaching, winning people to Jesus, mentoring them. And then he ran into a buzzsaw. Oh, it's the bane of those who preach the gospel. He ran into religious people. You say, wait a minute. You said there weren't any Christians there. Oh, there's a big difference in a Christian and a religious person. So he ran into these religious people. They were so jealous. He was, through the gospel, they were building this following, and some of these people were leaving their synagogues because these were Jewish people. That's the religion they had chosen. They were Jewish, and they were so mad. So you know what they did? They ran on Paul and his team right out of town. Paul and the guys went to Berea next, and they weren't there long, and they went on to Athens. And while Paul was in the city of Athens, somebody told him what these Thessalonians were experiencing. These young Christians, this young church, and Paul wrote them a letter back that was preserved in the Bible. It's called 1 Thessalonians, and in that book he talks about the things they were facing. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 3 and 4, Paul said, I know what you're experiencing. You're experiencing trials. 3 times he used the word troubles. Man, you're up against some real trouble. You're experiencing some trouble. I know you're in trouble. Their lives had taken a turn for the worse, and they were going through some really, really tough times. Wouldn't that be enough? Chapter 2, Paul said, right on top of this, I know you're being persecuted, that the religious people who ran us out of town, you're having to try to live with them. And they're making life hard on you. Matter of fact, in chapter 1, verse 6, he said, you're experiencing severe suffering. Did you catch that? Not just suffering at their hands, severe suffering because of what they're doing to you. So here they are. They got trials going on. They're being persecuted. Chapter 4, verse 1 through 8, and he said, oh yeah, and I know how sinful Thessalonica is, and I know that you guys are faced with temptation daily, constantly. As a matter of fact, the big deal was sexual temptation for some reason. He said, I know you are. These are the things that you're going through. How do you think Paul felt about this? Well, he tells us. Matter of fact, I want us to read a verse together. It's from 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 5. Look what Paul said. That is why, when I could bear it no longer, I sent Timothy to find out whether your faith was still strong. I was afraid. You see that? I was afraid that the tempter had gotten the best of you and that our work had been useless. Paul was afraid of what? He was afraid that all these challenges had weakened the faith of the Thessalonians. The phrase he used was, I was afraid your faith had been shaken. And if your faith had been shaken, that would make you vulnerable to your enemy. He called him the tempter, the devil. And I'm afraid that in your weakened state, the devil's going to find it easy to convince you that you ought to just give up. Don't go any further with this. Turn back. He said, I was so afraid that that would happen to you. So what did Paul do? According to chapter 2, verse 7 and 18, the first thing Paul did was he decided, I got to get back there. They need me. They're not going to survive this without me. And Paul said, so I packed a few things and tried to get there, but I couldn't because the devil stopped me. So, since the Apostle Paul was a man, what do men do when we try something and run into a wall? What do we do when we fall in the river and the little voice said, you ought to cut your losses and go home? You go, no. We stubbornly plow ahead. Paul said, so you know what I did? I tried again, and the devil stopped me again. So guess what I did? I tried again, and the devil stopped me again. Finally, he turned to Timothy, one of his teammates. And you can read about this in chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. He said, you try. I want you to go up there and check on these people and see how they're doing. They're going to need you to encourage them. They're going to need you to strengthen their faith. You've got to make sure their faith hasn't been shaken. You've got to make sure they don't give up. They keep going. You've got to do this, Timothy. So Timothy went and spent some time with him. He made it. He came back and sat the Apostle Paul down and said, boss man, let me give you a full report on what's happening. We can read some of it. Chapter 3, verse 6 through 9. Paul, when he wrote back to them, said, but Timothy has just returned, bringing us good news. Okay, good news. You see that? Good news. You know what Paul was anticipating? Tim, he's anticipating bad news. They've either given up or they're on the brink of giving up. Oh, that's what he's thinking. That's what he's going to. Instead, he gets good news about your faith and love. He reports that you always remember our visit with joy and that you want to see us as much as we want to see you. So we have been greatly encouraged in the midst of our troubles and suffering, dear brothers and sisters, because look how he describes them. You have remained strong in your faith. It gives us new life to know, look at this, you are standing firm in the Lord. How we thank God for you. Because of you, we have great joy as we enter God's presence. When Paul heard Timothy's news, his fears were relieved. The Thessalonians' faith had not been shaken. If anything, it was stronger. Their resolve to follow Christ had not been weakened. If anything, they were more committed than ever. They hadn't succumbed to temptation, but they were continuing to live to please God and not themselves. They hadn't given up, and they weren't just hanging on. They were thriving. According to Paul, and you can read about this in chapter 1, verse 7 through 10, in the midst of extreme challenges, the Thessalonians had risen to become an inspiration to believers. Not just in their city, not just in their country, but they had become an inspiration to believers in adjoining countries. Believers everywhere were watching them. Believers everywhere were talking about the Thessalonians. Believers everywhere were encouraged and inspired by their example. And that wasn't all. According to Paul, the Thessalonians were influencing unbelievers everywhere. Even though life was extremely challenging for this young church and these young Christians, they never stopped spreading the news about Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, Paul said it like this: the Word of God is ringing out from you everywhere. The Thessalonians had risen up to life's challenges. And if they could, we can. We can live as though life is good, even when it's not. We can feel as though life is good, even when it isn't good. We can prosper as though life is good, even when it's not. Here's the first lesson we can learn from the Thessalonians. We can rise above life's challenges. Bad news, life will be challenging. Good news, we can rise above life's challenges. How, you ask? We're going to start finding answers to that question next Sunday. But you don't have to wait on me. Why don't you go ahead and start reading the New Testament book of 1 Thessalonians. It's only 5 chapters. Read it to see if you can find some answers on your own. Search that book of the Bible carefully and see if you can identify how these people were able to rise above life's challenges. But until we meet again, promise me that you won't give up. Promise? I know that you're tired. I know that you're scared. I know that when you got up this morning, giving up seemed to be your only option. Well, it's not. I told you that my horrific Tuesday was not my low point of the week. No, that came on Thursday morning. I was so exhausted. My head was splitting. The only part of this sermon I had was my introduction. I'm sitting there kind of feeling sorry for myself. And I heard this small voice in the back of my head, Brian. The same one told me, you might have to cut your losses going home. And this is what the voice said to me. Why don't you text Tim? Why don't you text him right now? And tell him what's going on. So I'm going to read you my text, okay? You got a minute? I said, I'm going to whine a little bit. I'm convinced that I'm engaged in some kind of spiritual conflict. I'm not sleeping. For that reason, I'm constantly tired. I couldn't hold my eyes open all day yesterday. And I'm really fighting to keep depression at bay. Last night was the worst by far. I finally fell asleep around 2:30, but I was awake at 6:15. The morning greeted me with a monster headache. I'm trying to tame it enough so that I can think. What I'm saying is, pray for me. I need you to fight for me today and the remainder of this week. I have no idea what my schedule will be today. I almost said, I'm just trying to survive. Well, that's not what I want. I want to thrive. I want to thrive no matter what the enemy or the world throws at me. Tim responded and affirmed that he would be praying for me. And a few minutes later, he sent me this text. What you're preaching in this new series is so important for our church, but also for those on the periphery of our church who are watching us. I responded, yep, and I'm living it. I just want to raise the white flag, but I'm not going to give up. I'm going to rise up. Now listen, you are too. We are going to rise up and meet and overcome all the challenges that lay in front of us. You with me? Let's pray. Just search through your life for just a moment. What are the challenges you're currently facing? You're going through trials and tribulations. I don't know what they might be, relational, vocational, financial. Maybe it's physical with you, emotional. I don't know. There's something about your life right now that is extremely difficult. So difficult that at times you think about just giving up. And matter of fact, you hear this little voice in your head encouraging, that's what you ought to do. In this prayer, I want you to say something to God right there in the privacy of your heart. I want you to say this to Him. I'm not giving up. I'm not. But rather, God, with your help, I'm going to rise up. For some of you, there's an enemy of some sort, enemies that are just kind of facing you down right now. And you've thought about raising the white flag, surrendering, just giving up, and blending in. You don't have to do that. As a matter of fact, I don't know how intense the attacks against you have been, but here's what I want you to say to God right now. I'm not giving up. But rather, with your help, I'm going to rise up. I don't know how alluring and how appealing that some temptation has become to you. And maybe you've been thinking, I ought to just cave in. I ought to do it. Or maybe you have tasted the forbidden fruit. And you think, you know what? I ought to just give up. I ought to just give in to this. No, listen to me. Right now, here's what I want you to say to God. I'm not giving up. But rather, God, with your help, I'm going to rise up. Now, God, over these next few weeks, you teach us exactly how to do this. And God, you help us apply everything you share with us so that we live as though life is good, even when it's not. And we feel as though life is good, even when it's not. And that we prosper as though life is good, even though for the time being it is not. Thank you, God. Amen. You guys are free to go.